Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last in our Solutions seminar series. And we're very pleased tonight to have Dr. Steve Polasky from the University of Minnesota and the Natural Capital Project. Before I introduce Steve, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. On the table back there, you'll see some flyers for two things that you might be interested in. There's a course we're doing in the spring on measuring well-being, and that will be an attempt to, talk about all of the different approaches to measuring well-being, getting beyond things like GDP, including perhaps estimating the genuine progress indicator for the state of Oregon. We've got some interest in the state government in doing that. As you probably know, the state of Maryland has officially adopted the genuine progress indicator as one of their state statistics. So we're going to be talking about and working on that. There's a flyer about that in the back. There's also a flyer for a major conference that we'll be hosting here in Portland in the end of July 31st to August 4th, of the Ecosystem Services Partnership. So we're expecting a big turnout for that, and that will be all about ecosystem services coming of age, and how do we do the kinds of things I think that Steve is going to be talking about tonight. And if I'm not mistaken, Steve will be back here as a plenary speaker for that conference. You did accept our invitation, right? Good. So we're going to decide later whether we really, want to go through with that based on his performance tonight. But I'm sure he will give a great talk. I've heard him talk several times before. We were actually spent quite a bit of time together on what we now refer to as the Committee from Hell, which is an EPA committee on valuing ecosystems and ecosystem services. So we spent quite a few long hours haggling over many of the concepts I think that he'll be talking about tonight. And I think in the end it turned out to be quite a productive exercise, but it didn't seem like it during the process. The final thing I'll announce is there's a new journal that's just coming out called Ecosystem Services, so that relates to the topic tonight. I don't know if you've seen this yet or not from Elsevier. So there's huge and growing interest in this topic of ecosystem services. A whole new journal, conferences. Our conference here in Portland is actually not the only one. There'll be a few others during the year. One later in December, hosted by ACES, a community on ecosystem services in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And there's something called the Eco Summit, which will be happening in Columbus, Ohio in October. It has a large dose of ecosystem services thrown in. And our conference here in Portland, we arranged to be just before the Ecological Society of America's conference, which also has a big slug of ecosystem services reports going on there. So let me finish introducing Steve. So he has a PhD from the University of Michigan, and he's also a sort of an Oregon native. At least he was here for a while between 1993 and 1999. He was at Oregon State University in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. He's done all kinds of other things. I see here he was on the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1998 to 1999. That was in the Clinton administration. Yeah. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, recently elected, and the fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's written tons of papers. His main research interests, I think, as you'll see, include ecosystem services, natural capital, biodiversity conservation, endangered species policy, and largely integrating ecology and economics. So he's a professor of ecological economics there at the University of Minnesota. So, with no further ado, Steve, join me in welcoming Steve Polasky.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks very much. This is sort of like coming home. I spent 6 years down in Corvallis, and I loved it. And I actually thought I would probably be there the rest of my life. But then the University of Minnesota called and said, well, we actually have this position where you can be in an ecology department and be in an economics department at the same time, and we'll give you free reign and go to it. It's like, well, and it was during one of the periodic budget crises that hit higher education out here, so you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. Okay, so I want to talk about this notion of ecosystem services or valuing nature, but in particular, pulling this into decision making. So, it's one thing to just do this stuff, but does it make a difference? So how are we going to actually bring ecosystem services into decision making so that it actually matters, so that we make better decisions in the end? Now, I'm going to start. One can start lots of different places with thinking about ecosystem services. We could start with Bob's paper in 1997, a book by Gretchen Daly then. But I'm going to start actually with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And if you don't know about the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, this was a huge endeavor that brought together over 1,300 scientists from around the globe to basically take the pulse of the planet. How are we doing? What's happening to ecosystems? What's happening to biodiversity? And so this was basically to look at the status and trends of ecosystems and biodiversity. One of the really interesting things that came out of this was that they focused on the following theme. They said, we need to show that ecosystems and biodiversity are essential for human well-being. All right, that's the central theme. Now, that's come to be called, or even then it was called, but that about ecosystem services. So ecosystem services, the ways in which nature contributes to human well-being, that was really the central organizing principle of this. Now, you have to understand, that wasn't starting out. I was kind of surprised that they ended up here, because this, again, was about the status and trends of biodiversity and ecosystems. And they ended up, saying, well, we need to make the point. If we're going to sustain or conserve ecosystems and biodiversity, we need to show how much this matters. Now, at the time, this statement, ecosystems and biodiversity are essential for human well-being, I think most people would say that's probably true, but there was not a lot of, it was made more as an assertion rather than a lot of evidence. So after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, there were a lot of work called forth. Sort of the number of groups working on ecosystem services and showing the value of ecosystem services jumped dramatically. And so over the last few years, sort of almost everywhere I turn, and Bob, you probably have this too, everywhere you turn, there's a new group doing ecosystem services. But I want to take you back for a little bit, and whenever I go to black and white, I'm going to talk about economics. Okay, so there'll be the nice background when I'm talking about nature and things, but okay. So in economics, we always think about, and Bob mentioned GDP, gross domestic product, and it's a kind of standard yardstick that economists use. But it wasn't that long ago that this yardstick was even invented or around. So prior to the 1930s, there was really no systematic accounting for the state of the economy. Now, I'll talk about in a minute, this may not be the right yardstick, but there was really no system of accounts until the 1930s. So the Great Depression, and people said we need to pull together some notions of how we're doing. And the first estimates of national income were done in the 1930s. GDP really got going in the 1940s, and the first national income accounts were published in 1947. So this, prior to this, there's really no systematic accounting. We can't even answer the question, where are we in the business cycle? Are things going up or down? So what this did, and again, I'll talk about it in a moment, it provided a much clearer picture of the state of the economy, just in terms of income flows. Now, again, this may not be the right yardstick of things, but it did provide a window or way of organizing things so you could really get a pulse on, Are we going up in the business cycle? Are we in recession? And so forth. Now, the problem here is that GDP, which was really designed for a specific purpose, which was to measure the flow of activity in the economy, right? It's just the flow of income across, from firms or from people. Of course, it is not a measure of welfare, and it's not a measure of sustainability. It's not a measure of well-being. But it's gotten confused with that, so that people think, and maybe it's because it's got the field to itself. It's like, well, there's GDP out there, and I want to measure how we're doing. Well, there's GDP, and we don't have these other measures. There's been a lot of pushback against that. Certainly within economics, it's well known that GDP is not a measure of welfare. It is a measure of the flow of income. But there's been some high-level attention being put on this notion. So I just put up here, for example, a book that came out a couple years ago from a commission sponsored by the French government. The title, as you can read, is Mismeasuring Our Lives, Why GDP Doesn't Add Up. Two of the three authors are Nobel Prize winners in economics, Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen. And it's making the point that if you really want to think about well-being, quality of life, then you need other measures. It is not GDP. Okay, so now I'm back off of black, getting back to nature. So we know that ecosystems provide a wide array of goods and services of value, these ecosystem services. But we're kind of like we were in economics before 1930. We do not have a way of systematically accounting for the value of these services, showing how human well-being is impacted by these ecosystem services. So in a way, it's like we're looking out at nature through a very clouded window. We lack the right set of measures and accounts to judge how we're doing. Now, if you don't have the right viewpoint, if you can't see things clearly, you will oftentimes make mistakes. So as I put up here, distorted views oftentimes lead to distorted decisions. Okay, we make decisions that systematically reduce ecosystem services, diminish them, and that we need to do a better job. So part of what we're up to here then is, can we actually get a better or fuller, clearer picture of what the consequences of our actions are? And that's really this notion then of trying to account for ecosystem services, show the impacts of our choices, and hopefully end up with, in the end, again, better decisions. Okay, so one of the ways of sort of wrapping up or synthesizing what I'm talking about is, can we quote mainstream ecosystem services? And what I mean by that is, can we factor in ecosystem services into all the decisions that get made? So by individuals or by businesses or by government agencies. I don't want this to be something off to the side or something that you think about as an afterthought. I want this to be factored in the same way that if you go buy a cup of coffee, you have to pay the price of coffee. Can we actually factor in these ecosystem services into everyday decision making? Okay, in order to do this, I'm going to break this into 3 tasks, and I'm going to talk about each of them. But the first task is understanding what is it that we do that impacts on ecosystems. Right? How do human actions, growing food, producing energy, going about our day-to-day lives, how does that affect ecosystems, and how does that then affect the provision of ecosystem services? Then the second is, how important is that? So if I change ecosystem services, like we change water quality, we change how much carbon is sequestered and hence how much carbon is in the atmosphere, how much difference does that make? What's the value of those services? And then the third one is, okay, if we understood something about provision and value and how those change under our actions, could we actually create incentives for the sustainable provision of ecosystem services, right? So that's sort of a policy aspect. So the first two, or if you want to break it out this way, the first one is really largely ecological science or natural science question, right? So how do we do things that impact on ecosystems, and how does that lead to changes in things that we care about from these systems? The second one is largely social science. For the most part in this talk, I'll actually focus on sort of an economic take on value, but there are other takes. There's certainly other ways to think about value to people. And then the last one is not as much science, but okay, how do we get things done? What's the policy approach? Okay, well, I like, and as you'll see in a moment, I really like maps and being sort of spatially oriented. But this is just another way of seeing this, how we might put these pieces together. So again, I'm really focused on this high level of decisions. How do we impact choices? Now, there is, at the left-hand side, you can think about, well, how do we set the structure? How do we set the stage? What are the incentives? What's the framework by which individuals or firms make decisions? So people who are going to do things which act on the ground and through their actions affect ecosystems, right? So across the top, it's all about decisions and who's making decisions, how are they making decisions, and then that leads to impacts, right? So we have impacts on ecosystems. Now, we could stop the analysis here. Like if this were just something about how much impact are we having on a system, we can talk about, just sort of straightforward. I'm calling it non-anthropocentric. So we could say, look, Endangered Species Act, we need to protect endangered species, and therefore really all we need from a policy perspective is to say, are we causing harm or jeopardy to an endangered species? End of story. Okay, but we might want to go further, and we might want to talk about ecosystem services. Why is this important, or what's the value to society? And I've labeled this as ecological production functions. In other words, if I know the structure and function of the ecosystem, how does that lead to the provision of these ecosystem services that people care about? And then I could think about, if we drained a wetland in order to plant crops, we get increased crop production, we get less storm, flood protection, we maybe have lower water quality downstream. What are the trade-offs in a biophysical sense among the services that we might care about? So we could stop there. Or we could say, well, what we really want to do is we want to think about these trade-offs in terms of the benefits and costs. So how important is it, is the crop production increase, is that more valuable than the diminution of water quality or the change in flood protection we have? So we could use valuation to try to think about these things in terms of a common metric. If you do this in a certain way, you can talk about the economic efficiency of it. But what I'm really trying to lay out here is that there's a number of steps in thinking about this, and it's legitimate to think about biophysical trade-offs. It's legitimate to think about economic efficiency and whether you're going to use one or the other. And I'll talk about several examples. Depends in some circumstances on the, sort of the political circumstances, but also how easy is it, for example, to do that valuation step. And there's certain ecosystem services where that step may be fairly straightforward. There are others where it's extremely difficult. And so if it's extremely difficult, you might, in fact, want to not put this into dollar benefit or into the same metric, but think about this in terms of just what's the impact, biophysical impact. What's the impact on species, for example, or what's the impact on water quality? And of course, into policy decisions, it's not just this. There are other considerations, procedural considerations, distributional consequences, and so on. But anyway, this is a way of putting together those three things I talked about in the last slide. So we're trying to mainstream ecosystem services, get this into thinking about policies and thinking about decisions made by individuals. There's the provision step, the evaluation step, and as I said, the policy step. Okay, so what I want to do is sort of follow through on these three notions, the provision, value, and policy, and then give you, so I'm going to give you, in a sense, a very high level or fairly quick run through those three steps, and then give you a couple of examples of the integrated analysis of these ecosystem services. And it's really nice to do it here because, as you'll see, there's papers that I'm going to talk about. All are based in the Willamette Basin. So this is work that started when I was at Oregon State. There was a phenomenal group of researchers here from University of Oregon, Oregon State, some of the federal agencies and other places that put together data. And so it was, there was no better laboratory, basically, for us to work in than in the Willamette Basin. So it's nice to be back in the Willamette Basin to talk about these. Okay, and then I'll offer some brief summary thoughts. Okay, I want to mention a word about sort of where some of the tools of analysis come from and this relatively unique partnership, this Natural Capital Project. The goal of the Natural Capital Project is to mainstream ecosystem services. This partnership is between two conservation organizations, so World Wildlife Fund and Nature Conservancy, and two academic institutions, so Woods Institute of the Environment at Stanford and the Institute on the Environment at University of Minnesota. We've put together one of the products of this Natural Capital Project is software, which is freely available up on the web, called Invest, for integrated valuation of ecosystem services and trade-offs. And what is Invest? So what Invest is it really is a set of models, of computer-based models. It's modular-based, so what we're really interested in are multiple ecosystem services, also biodiversity conservation, and so in a sense, it's each service or biodiversity conservation is a separate module, so you can run, if you're just interested in water quality, you can do that, although frankly, I would say if you're just interested in water quality, there are water quality models that you could go out and run. What we're interested in is the combination of the multiple ecosystem services that are generated from a system, from a landscape. We're also interested in figuring out how are these going to change through time. So if you did certain things to the landscape, you changed land use, or in principle you could think about climate change, how will that impact the ecosystem services provided by that landscape? It's spatially explicit because things happen in space. If you put in nutrients in a certain place in the watershed, it will flow through the watershed in a particular manner. So you need to know where things happen. As I indicated before, sometimes you want to just know biophysically. So what is the water quality? What's the phosphorus level in the water? And sometimes you may wish to report things in terms of dollars and cents, economic outputs. And we tried to make this sort of flexible and transferable. So there are general principles that hold, and we wire those into the system, but each individual application, there may be specialized data, there may be special issues that might be concerned, but we're trying to make a general tool that then can be fit to particular instances or places, applications. Very briefly on this slide, I'm going to be talking about I'm kind of the guy behind the scenes mostly, and I do these kinds of models, the biophysical and economic models, and that leads to outputs. But there is a whole other part of the process, which is if this works well, you at the beginning involve stakeholders who are interested in this landscape. What are the issues? What are the services that are important? What are the potential decision points that people are worried about or concerned about? That leads you to develop the set of scenarios. What might land use change or population change that is important? That then determines sort of how you set up the models. So I'm not going to talk too much about the stakeholder engagement. That's not really my expertise, but just to let you know that the modeling itself, or the kind of provision and value parts, should, if you're doing this right, fit into a larger discussion with people who actually are in that, in whatever landscape or application you're talking about. Okay, and then anytime you're doing one of these models or thinking about provision of ecosystem service, social and ecological systems are complex beasts. And so how much of that reality do you capture? So this, quote, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, we would love, in a sense, to get towards tier 3. We would love to have the details and richness and so forth. And in academia, there's a constant pressure to, make this more complicated, incorporate more things. You left out that factor. To make this practical, however, and especially in places, we want to do this globally. So think about rural Tanzania or Chile or some other place. You may not have the data to implement a complicated, detailed, nuanced model. So how do we negotiate between data reality, which may be require very simple models, and the sort of need or desire to have models that are more complex that take into account more factors. So we oftentimes are going back and forth on this scale. And the way we've tried to handle it in the invest world is to offer different, quote, tiers. Some very simple that require only globally available data, like you could use IPCC data for carbon sequestration, for example, up to very detailed models where you can use very site-specific data. And these models or approaches are appropriate for answering different kinds of questions. If I was actually doing a payments for ecosystem services where there's real money on the line and the actual quantity of the service and the value of the service, we want to know that. You have to go towards the more complex. If we're just thinking about where are important places on the landscape, quote, priority setting, a simpler model may suffice. Okay, and then if you're further interested, there's a book that Peter Kariva is the lead author on called Natural Capital, where we talk about some of these issues further. Okay, so let me get into it then. I want to talk very briefly about each of these three steps, the provision, value, and policy. And before I get there, really, again, the starting point for all of this is we need to have something as an input into understanding what the provision are, and that's what I'm calling scenarios. Now, scenarios really are just a set of conditions that are used as input into analysis. So it might be like a land use map. It could be climate change scenarios, or what's the human population on this landscape. But really, I'm going to focus here really on this land use scenario. So I have a map of what happens and where does it happen on the landscape. And that's what I'm going to feed into all of the following models, the ecosystem service models. Okay, so what we want, if I tell you sort of what happens where on the landscape, I give you this map, we want to be able to predict then the provision of ecosystem services under that land use scenario or under that map. And if I change the map, how does that change the provision of services provided? So let me just walk you through two potential ecosystem services. One is carbon sequestration on the landscape, and the other is habitat for biodiversity. And these will also illustrate, in a sense, the sort of tiered approach, especially in the habitat for biodiversity. We can do very simple models or much more complicated models. Okay, so the point of carbon sequestration, we want to know how much carbon is stored on the landscape, which means we're keeping track of various pools of carbon. So how much is in the above-ground biomass, in the trees or the grasses? How much is in the roots below ground, so the below-ground biomass? Soil, litter, and then in some applications we'll talk about harvested wood products. So in the Willamette basin, obviously there's a huge timber industry. Some of the wood that's cut down is put into furniture or into housing. That does not immediately decay. There is some residence time that's still sequestered. It's not up into the atmosphere. So we might want to account for that as well. Okay, so the simplest version of this was we'd use data, let's say, from IPCC to talk about the carbon stored by the land use. So if it's a forest type, we'd want to know, so what trees are there, what's the age of the trees, soil type, in order to get at the estimates of above ground, below ground, soil litter, and so forth. And then that's storage, and if we're interested in a service of sequestration or how much did it change, we look at the storage at one time period, storage at another time period, and look at the change in the storage, and that's the carbon sequestration. Now, for the U.S., there's pretty good data, for example, especially in forested systems, about how much forest systems store carbon of various types. If you go elsewhere, the data can get sparser, but there actually is pretty good data, especially for forested systems globally. We can use, and it's getting better all the time, use LiDAR to measure heights of vegetation and relationships between the amount of volume of vegetation and the amount of carbon stored in it. Okay, what about habitat for biodiversity? Well, what oftentimes we're interested in here, and I'm gonna make, for the moment, biodiversity being species conservation. So I'm trying to protect or conserve various species and create conditions for viable populations of those species. Well, the simplest version, the sort of tier 1 version, is say, well, species depend upon habitat, and so what we want to know is the amount and quality of that habitat. We can do a slightly more complicated version to say, well, habitat quality also matters, not just quantity, and the quality is a function of what it borders. So if you've got an edge of a forest, that may not be as good as interior of a forest. Anyway, there are approaches that do this, basically account for the amount or the quantity as well as the quality of habitat. One can do a slightly more complicated version. So we can go, instead of just habitat types, we can talk about species by species models. In fact, one of the applications I'll talk about in a moment does this. So what we need here, especially if you're going to do this for lots and lots of species, is you need to keep it fairly simple. So we build off of 3 life history characteristics. So what counts as habitat? That first point is habitat compatibility. How much habitat do you need in order to establish a given size population? So obviously, if it's a large mammal like a bear or a mountain lion, you need a lot more space than if we're talking about field mice. And then dispersal ability. So how able is the species to utilize different patches of habitat across the landscape? So there's a sort of a penalty for fragmentation. Okay, so the point of these things is that we have this map of land use, landscape level. We use these models in order to predict how well are we doing on the provision of services, be it carbon sequestration. I didn't talk about water quality, but one could do that. Amount of crop production, habitat for biodiversity, etc. Okay, what about the second, the valuation? And as I said, I'm going to focus on economic valuation, but there are other things that one might want to think about. So what we're really interested in is what's the impact on human well-being, right? How do we measure that? So economists have one answer. Again, this is not the only answer that's out there, but how do we do this? How do we value nature? How do we value ecosystem services? Well, one approach, and frankly, if you're dealing, especially in the United States, if you can tie something to market values, it's a lot easier to not have your science questioned, right? So many of the things that we're talking about here, timber production, crop production, right? Or so like a pollination services might be important because it increases crop production, either the quantity or the quality. Well, if I want to measure the value of that service, I need to look at how much did it increase crop production, and I can look at the price of those crops in order to get some sense of the importance or the value of them. But many things that we're interested in are not going to be tied to market values. I mean, that's really the whole problem in the first place, that most of these ecosystem services don't go through markets. People don't take into account on the economic side their importance. They have real importance, but they don't show up in markets. So there's a number of tools that economists, and I'll run through them very quickly, and then the sort of revealed and stated preferences. And also there's an approach, a cost-based approach, which has been applied a lot in this area of thinking about the importance. We're trying to show the kind of monetary measured in monetary terms, what's the importance of these ecosystem services or the value of these services. Okay, so market valuation, as I said, many things do go through, especially provisioning services, go through markets. And they have observed prices. So if we're doing something that changes the production of agricultural crops or timber production, we can look at the price of those crops, We'd want to subtract out the production costs of them, so it's not simply just looking at the revenue, but looking at what economists would call the rent. So how much additional value, or the benefits created minus the cost of production, in order to say something about the value of that service. Let me skip this. If you have large changes in quantities, you might be changing prices, and there's measures of surplus or rent changes that you're really trying to get after. Okay, what about non-market? Well, carbon sequestration. We don't, in the U.S., have a market for value of carbon. Habitat for biodiversity, no market for that. Water quality. The list goes on. Most ecosystem services don't go through. So how do we get a sense of how important this is? As I say, economists will typically try to use one of two methods. One is a revealed preference argument. So there's some observed choice that people make. And from those choices that they make and the prices that they are associated with those choices, we can try to uncover something about how important this ecosystem service or value of nature is. Now, the advantage is it's tied to real decisions that people make that have consequences, but you can't use it for everything. And I'll show you in a moment. And then, failing that, we can ask people. So stated preference. Use survey questions to ask how people would value nature. The advantage here is you can ask, the only limitation is your imagination. You can ask people about anything. The disadvantage is it's not tied to a real choice. So people worry about the hypothetical nature. And would they really give you the same answer if it were a real choice as opposed to answering a survey question? Okay, let me give you an example, though, of this revealed preference in practice. So, and again, very local. So Brent Mahan was a student of mine at Oregon State. He was working here up in Portland, and we tried to ask the question, how important was it to have wetlands? Okay, so would that show up? And the way we were going to do this is we were going to look at the values of homes, and homes that were situated close to wetlands and far from wetlands and particular kinds of wetlands. So here we go, home sales in Portland, Oregon for the time period 1992 to 1994. Now, in general, one thinks that a home value depends upon lots of things, not all of which are related to the environment. So it depends upon, how big is the house and how many rooms and when was it built and something about the neighborhood and what are the quality of the schools, how far is it from downtown and so forth. But it also depends upon the environmental characteristics of the neighborhood in which it's in. So in particular, we had lots of information, so geographical, GIS data on distance to wetland, distance to stream, how close was it to parks, and so on. So what we did, and I won't bore you with the statistics, this is, for those of you who know, it's multiple regression analysis, so holding other factors constant, and when you've got roughly 15,000 data points, you've got a lot of statistical power here. So we could say, if I took an otherwise similar house, and the only thing I'm going to change is I'm going to move it closer to a wetland. Okay, I'm going to put it 1,000 feet closer to a wetland. How would that change the value of the house? And you can see the answer there at the bottom. So I thought when we started this that the value would be, we would not be able to pick anything up. People, do you all want to live close to a wetland? You're Portland residents. Anyway, Portland residents want to live closer to wetlands. And there it is, and closer to streams, and closer to lakes. Actually, if you really press me on this, I'd say, what am I picking up here? I'm not sure necessarily it's wetlands per se that people want to live close to, but what happens with wetlands? You can't develop them. This is open space. This is green space, right? So people definitely have a preference for living close to green spaces. So part of this is, part of this may be wetlands, part of this may be a preference for living closer to green spaces or to nature. Okay, so, one can do these kinds of exercises. In fact, Noah Nedesil at Reed College has done a number of really good studies of the value of open space, and most of this actually based in the Portland area. Okay, what about, I wanted to just say a word about, quote, these cost-based approaches. And economists get really nervous about this because they say, well, what we're trying to measure is benefits, and this is about costs. It's like saying, I'm trying to measure demand, and now you're going to tell me about supply. But despite that, there's been used a lot in this world. In fact, probably the most cited, the thing that gets talked about the most in ecosystem services or demonstrating the value of ecosystem services, you probably know where this is going, right? The New York City water case. So New York City protected the Catskills, watersheds in the Catskills in order to not have to build a filtration plant. So they avoided the cost of building the filtration plant by providing clean water, by protecting the watersheds upstream. This has gotten that story has got many sequels to it. Now there are a huge number of things called water funds in South America that have the same idea. So Bogota, Quito, Ecuador have protected their water supplies by doing conservation upstream, have a surcharge on water, and that water surcharge is used to protect upstream watersheds. Okay. I said this. So replacement costs and avoided damages oftentimes are used, and under the right set of circumstances, they are perfectly valid. But these can be, they're not always appropriate. But and let me give you an example. So sometimes people say, well, like with environmental regulation, sometimes we get marketable permit prices. So the U.S. under the Clean Air Act, businesses who emit sulfur dioxide can trade sulfur dioxide emissions. So why not use that permit price as the price or the value of the ecosystem service? Okay, well, so under these sort of cap and trade systems, and as I say, under the Clean Air Act, we have one for sulfur dioxide emissions and for NOx emissions. There's actually in fisheries, there's individually transferable quotas and so forth. Okay, so the price of the emission really reflects the marginal cost of abatement or of meeting that cap. And there's no guarantee that the marginal cost of abatement equals the real benefit from having, say, cleaner air in this case. And just to drive this point home, so think about not air pollution but carbon. Now, we have no cap and trade, as you know, for carbon emissions in the U.S. But back a few years ago, when there was talk about perhaps moving towards this, a voluntary organization called the Chicago Climate Exchange was operating. So I took prices here was from January 2008. Strictly voluntary, so companies could join in, and they had to, in order to meet the requirements of being as part of this exchange, they had to curtail their emissions on the order of 4 or 5% from a baseline of, I think it was in 2000. At the same time, in Europe, they were under Kyoto. There were real requirements for them to reduce emissions. Okay? Now, carbon is carbon. It doesn't matter whether it's emitted in the U.S. or in Europe. It goes into the global atmosphere, right? And it mixes. So here we have a system where, at the same time, in the U.S., we're valuing things at $2.30 a metric ton for carbon under the Chicago Climate Exchange. The Europeans are valuing it at 21 euro. And that's when euro was real money as compared to the dollar. So there's, it's $30 to $2. Okay? It's the same stuff. It's carbon, right? So what does this reflect? This reflects the stringency of the market, of the institution. It's not really reflecting the true benefits of reducing carbon emissions. Okay? So this is a note of caution in terms of using some of these cost-based approaches. Okay. Very quickly on policy, because I think I'm getting kind of close to time. I want to make sure I get to the thing. So I'll just say that, this isn't actually, not everything here is new. And people have thought about the problem of what economists call externalities or providing public goods for a long period of time. So how do I provide the farmer who's causing problems downstream, how do I give incentives to him? And there's a huge number of approaches. One can use the legal regulatory structure. So we have rules, like if I'm talking land use, there's zoning. We can talk about cap and trade or incentive-based approaches, like I talked about with air pollution policy, or payments for ecosystem services. And there are also sort of information-based or negotiation, community, and consensus approaches. So there's a wide range of tools out there that can be applied in this area. Okay, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time because I want to make sure I talk about the Willamette Basin. So there was a paper that we did where we were really focused, and it was actually before much of the focus on ecosystem services, at least in my group, but thinking about biodiversity conservation and returns to landowners and what were the trade-offs between them. So we wanted to look at land use patterns and the impact that they had on both the kind of marketed commodities of agriculture, timber, and housing, and how well were we going to do in terms of protecting, in this case, it's terrestrial vertebrates. So 267 terrestrial vertebrate species that breed in the Willamette Basin. Okay? So the biological model uses the land use patterns, what counts as habitat, how well does the species disperse, how much area does it need. The economic model is really a set of models like what's the productivity of the land for agricultural crops or timber. If we put this into housing development, what would be the value of that housing? And this being Oregon, we were actually just looking at land outside of the urban growth boundary. So we're looking basically at rural land. And then what we're going to try to do is to find out where should we put things if we're trying to achieve these two objectives of conserving species and also giving returns to the landowners. Okay, we have different choices. So there's agricultural outputs that we could do, row crop agriculture or orchard vineyard. Basically what we're trying to do here is model all of the land use choices that one could do, which have important differences either on the economic side or on the biological side. So would a species look at an orchard different than they would a cornfield? And the answer is yes. So we modeled them separately. Okay, you know the Willamette Basin. There it is. The right-hand side was what we used as our base level map. It's a 1990 land cover map that David Hulse from University of Oregon put together initially. And the result of the analysis is as follows. So the way to read this is to say along the horizontal axis is the return to, in economic terms, the dollar terms of agriculture, of timber, and housing values. On the vertical axis is how well did we do in terms of species. So if we have different land use pattern, how many of the species of those 267 do we expect to be able to be conserved? Okay, so you can see that there's quite a number of species. I mean, roughly close to 230 of these that are going to do fine no matter what we do on the landscape. And that's not true everywhere, but in Oregon, many species can live in managed forests. If there's a forest rotation, so there's forests of different age, they'll do fine. Not true for all species, obviously, but for some. So what we get then is this analysis which shows us what's possible from this landscape. So all these points here are sort of what we call the efficiency frontier. So if I was trying to, say, maximize economic returns, there I am. Or I'm trying to do as best I can for species, here I am. And these are other combinations that show, like in here, I'm doing pretty well for both. Okay, not as high as up here for species, not quite as high as here for economics, but pretty high on both. And you can see this is really steep. So I get, if I really try to just focus solely on economic returns, there's a huge cost in terms of species conservation. Similarly here, if I get to the last few units of trying to increase, say, old growth dependent species, there's a huge cost in terms of the economics. But there are these places where am I? There we go, where we do pretty well on both. Okay? And the maps here associate what the land use pattern is with each of those points on the curve. Okay, so now I've told you about points A through H. What's point I? Point I was the current landscape, right? So when people say, and I remember living out here, and it was like, it's jobs versus spotted owls. It's economics versus the environment. And, if you're point D, it is. If you're at point I, you're just being dumb, right? You can do better for both the species and the economic returns. And how, whether you go just this way or this way depends upon the priorities of society. But by better thinking about where to locate things and what happens as a consequence of choices, you can actually improve the outcomes, both on the environment side and on the economic side. One can, sort of disentangle this analysis and get to sort of, so what I did here was we just pointed out sort of which species do well. So like from point A to point B, which are the species that increase, and by how much do they increase in their probabilities of persistence? And there's lots of species here that depend upon very rare habitat types in the basin. So if you preserve prairie, you preserve riverine wetlands, you can get huge increases in species conservation at very low costs. Unfortunately, here's the spotted owl. And the spotted owl is expensive. I mean, there was a reason why there was a conflict out here over the spotted owl. Okay. Again, the point here is, where do you want to end up on the frontier? It depends on basically how important is it to society. How would they trade off species conservation versus these economic returns? Okay, I'm going to do this last one, and then I'll wrap up so we have at least a little bit of time for questions. So I also want to talk about one. So that one was just species and economic returns. But what about ecosystem services? So what if we care about water quality and flooding and carbon sequestration? So what we did here was we looked at different scenarios of land use going forward. And we used invest models to say, under these different land use plans, how well did we do under these various scenarios? Okay? And so the green is this conservation-oriented scenario, and the red and the blue, one is a development-oriented scenario, and one is sort of keep the past going, plan, trend, sort of business as usual. And you can see the green does better on all except for, what do landowners get? So if it's up to them, and they don't get paid for ecosystem services, they're going to choose the blue or the red path, not the green path. Okay? And that's what's shown here if you look at the circles. If we say on the horizontal axis, here's the present value of returns to the landowners. Again, they do better under the blue and the red path than they do under the green path. But the biodiversity is much better under the green path. So this is kind of the classic trade-off. You want biodiversity, you want economic returns, there's a trade-off. Well, not so fast. What if we look at the triangles here on the right? So what I'm going to do here, I've added in the value of paying for not all ecosystem services, but one ecosystem service. So what if we could pay landowners for carbon sequestration? Okay, just carbon alone. That's enough to change this pattern from instead, in fact, this one is higher valued now to landowners. So if you pay them for ecosystem services, now there's not a trade-off between biodiversity and their own interests. It's more valuable for society, and it's better for biodiversity conservation, right? So again, the importance of mainstreaming ecosystem services is that we can get very different decisions with different outcomes, which may be better for the environment. It may also be better for human well-being, okay? So that's really trying to demonstrate then the importance of incorporating this. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I will stop right here and see. There's a couple of summary things, but you can ask questions and we can go on from there. But this is really one of the main points that I wanted to get to. So thanks very much, and Bob will turn it over to you and we open it up. So thanks.
Okay, if you have questions, please come up to the microphone. Maybe while we're waiting, Steve, there's a lot of talk these days about ecosystem service markets, and I'm not sure that markets, at least conventional markets, are the right institution for dealing with these public goods. So there's been also ideas about common asset trusts or some other institution that you can sort of embed some of these economic incentives within that do things a little bit differently. But what's your view on that? Don't we need some different kinds of institutions to really do this properly?
Right. So, The markets thing is really interesting. There's a lot of people, I think, who kind of naively latch on to the market and say, well, we need to provide incentives, so we'll just take a market instrument. I mean, the whole problem with many of these things, and you put your finger right on it, these are public goods. I mean, there's a reason why there isn't a market, right? They don't have the characteristics of going and buying a cup of coffee. How are you going to put a market on the air you breathe? Now, there are ways of doing this, and the SO2 market that I talked about very briefly is one good example. But it's not a pure market in the sense that it took government action in the first place in order to set up that market. So we had to create scarcity by limiting the amount of emissions of SO2, for example, that could be put into the air. So once that step was done, and then we say, okay, well, firms, you can buy and sell this, but you have to remain under that cap, right? Fine, now we've created a market, but that market wasn't just, it didn't start generically. It started from government action in the first place, which was a regulatory action that limited the amount of emissions. Carbon markets, the same thing. There's a limit on how much can be emitted of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. So, so a lot of people are thinking about, well, let's set up markets and we can get people to supply credits. Fine, they might supply them, but who wants to buy them? I mean, without the cap or government regulatory action or some means of trying to get the representation of the value of these public goods, you won't have a market. So leave it there.
Hi, my name is Kevin. Excuse me. I'm new to Portland, new to Oregon. I just moved out here from Wisconsin. So I have two questions. The first is in the Willamette Valley. What is the size, the scale of agriculture? Is it industrial agriculture? Or there's still a lot of small family farms out in the valley? And my second question then would be, if you see interaction between the small family farms and their preservation of species diversity or ecosystem quality versus that of industrial agriculture, big tractor farm in the valley, and how that conflict plays out.
Okay, great. So I am not the expert on agriculture in the Willamette Basin, but I will tell you a few things, which is compared to Wisconsin or Minnesota even more so, agriculture out here is incredibly diverse. I mean, you don't have to be much of an expert to understand Minnesota agriculture. It's like corn, soybeans, corn, soybeans. But in Minnesota, in the Willamette Basin, it's incredibly diverse. There's a huge number of different crops. Farms here tend to be smaller, but not. I mean, but there's plenty of industrial agriculture out here. But again, I'm not the total expert on this. One of the interesting things for us in this, like if we did this kind of trade-off analysis, in fact, we have done this in Minnesota now, you tend to get higher trade-offs between, so water quality and biodiversity versus what you get in terms of like returns to landowners, right? Because there, the main land owning, the main economic productive activity is farming, and it's intensive farming, right? So as you know from Wisconsin, and so if you want to get people off of intensive agriculture and into other things, maybe you can get some niche crops that are less environmentally destructive and not lose too much money. But if you're going to put in like stream side buffers in order to get higher water quality, there is a cost to the farmer. So there's a much more direct trade-off. I mean, here what we were really happy about was, there is agriculture in the valley floor, but we're really talking about lots of forested landscapes. And there's more of an ability to produce ecosystem services and still produce timber by thinking about it carefully. Whereas in agriculture, especially the kind of agriculture in the Midwest, the kind of conflict trade-offs come much earlier in the game. Not that there aren't trade-offs. I mean, we did a recent study in Minnesota where we could show that we could basically decrease the amount of phosphorus exports in this watershed at no cost. We could reduce 20% of them at no cost just by kind of doing the same thing here. Let's look carefully at what the practices are in the land use, and we can reduce it. We wanted to get to 50 or 80% production. Reductions. It was really costly. But there always are some. There's some you can do better by actually taking account of both. What do the farmers want to do, but also what are the environmental consequences, and rejiggering how they do what they do.
While we're waiting, I think you had one if you want to come up to the microphone. But just to follow up maybe on that one, Steve, farmers in the U.S. are said to be farming the subsidies rather than farming the land. And so we are heavily subsidizing a lot of agricultural production.
Yep.
If we're going to do that, why don't we subsidize things that are actually of public goods like ecosystem services? So we can pay farmers to produce those services as well as producing the crops that they're producing, move things in the direction that you're talking about.
Well, if I were in charge, or if you were in charge, that's the way the world would work. Let's subsidize things that we really do care about or create the public good, rather than line somebody's, one particular group's pocket. So one of the things that actually we did some work which made us extremely unpopular in Minnesota and the rest of the Midwest on ethanol, and showing, we had these huge subsidies in ethanol. And one of the claims that the groups pushing this, the corn groups and others, were saying, oh, this is environmentally friendly. We're replacing fossil fuels. So we said, okay, let's take this seriously. Let's do the analysis, and let's compare the life cycle emissions for carbon and for other environmental consequences of doing ethanol versus doing fossil fuel that we replace. And lo and behold, what we found was ain't much different. So, that one was clearly a case. This is a case of political economy, right? There was not environmental justification. It was, how do we support income to farm groups? But again, why not? If that's your goal, if supporting income to farmers, why not pay them for ecosystem services? There are lots of ecosystem services out there that by changing their practices they can contribute to. At times I get very frustrated, as I'm sure most people do, about watching the political process in the U.S. And kind of, rationality or sensible government and policy, and what do we do? And they don't match up very well. That ethanol work actually that I referred to, that came at a key instant, and actually managed us and several other people who published articles actually managed to change the debate or had an influence on it. So, as a scientist or as an academic or whatever, it's easy to lose confidence or faith and say, why am I doing this? Nobody ever pays any attention. But if you have a powerful message and you keep bringing the facts to the table over and over and over again, and do it, and if you're lucky and figure out the right time, because there are, like in that ethanol debate, there were key instances when it actually made a difference. The other thing that made a difference there was the people who said, the more you subsidize ethanol and the more the corn crop goes to there as opposed to food or feed, that's going to have influences on food prices, and that coincided with the spike in food prices around the world. The debate changed. There was no longer this sort of groundswell of support for corn-based ethanol. So, yeah.
Maybe two more questions.
So I have a question about time. Specifically, if you look at sort of, there's a forest, you cut down the trees,
Yep.
You get a value right now. You conserve it, this is a value that accumulates over a lot of time. So how does that decision-making process go into the framework that you're using and to solving this problem in general?
Yeah, good question. So actually, let me go back to this. So in the first model that I talked about, in a sense, we did what I'll call a static analysis, try to do time. So if I had that, like a map of the landscape, and that was just going to be constant through time, I was always going to have it, what would be the consequences in terms of ecosystem services? So if I had a mature forest on each of those forest parcels, what would be? So that's one question, but what you're asking about is what's about transition? So if I have ag land now and I want to plant a forest there, I don't instantly get the carbon. I don't instantly get all these benefits. So what we did here actually is we had 10 years, we evaluated it every decade over the 6-year time period. So if land use changed in, let's say, 2000, and we started a forest, we planted a forest then, we would have 0-year-old trees in 2000. We'd have 10-year-old trees in 2010. We'd have 20-year-old trees in 2020. And we can keep track of the amount of, say, carbon stored or the other physical processes based on the stand age of the trees. And we kept track of that as we did this.
Last question. Excuse me. I'm a member of 2 different watershed groups, a watershed council and a friends group. And I came here to try to learn how we might apply some of these concepts to encourage the investment in restoration work of existing natural areas. We do other things too, but so have you had experience to help you understand what the reaction is to applying these concepts in to the restoration of a natural area, culvert replacements, habitat planting, new native, eradication of non-natives? Is there a gap there that you can't close, or do people get the impact?
Yeah, good question. And so let me give you an example. So part of our group, this Natural Capital Project, and again, I'm probably the wrong person to answer that question in the sense that I'm the backroom guy, right? I'm the geek who works on the models. They don't, other than you guys, they don't bring me out in public too often. But our group worked really intensively in Hawaii with a group, the Kamehameha Schools. And the Kamehameha Schools are the largest landowners in Hawaii. And they have historically had a mission that they are supposed to manage the lands in order to produce the highest return in order to fund the schools. Well, they also care about lots of, they're tied to Hawaiian culture, and they care about ecosystems. They don't want to just maximize their financial. They care about these other things. So anyway, with them, we had a sort of a ready audience. They were ready to do this, and they really wanted to know, well, if we manage our land in different ways, if we had, if we really take seriously trying to maximize our value right now, we'll probably put up a housing development. We don't want to do that. And so we actually analyzed all these services and showed what the trade-offs were. And they actually, in the end, chose, they said, we don't want the housing development. We want another thing which does okay in terms of value, but also produces all these other sets of services. Now, that's an easy case, right? We had a landowner dealing with them that wanted to, was already receptive. What I found so let me go back to that ethanol case, because in 2008, criticizing ethanol in the state of Minnesota, well, let's put it this way. So we had people saying, there's rogue science going on at that university. You're doing bad science because you're questioning our industry. So I gave a talk once to the Agricultural Round Table. And my department head said, you have to go talk to these people because they're really upset. And I thought, oh, God, no. Let's put a big target on me, enemy. But basically what I did is I said, here's the analysis. I'm just going to take you through it. And fortunately for me, the analysis was really simple. It's nothing more really than a spreadsheet. You do this on the land, and here are all the carbon pools, and here's how they change. You don't like my assumption, I'm going to lay them all out here for you. Okay, if you want a question, here's where the questions would arise. So we did it all through. And, they didn't shoot me. And actually, several of them afterwards came up and said, okay, I understand exactly, I get it. And, we may agree to disagree in terms of values, but, they understood the thing. So it was sort of a clear message. Now, there's a dark lining to this story or whatever, which is on an individual basis or talking to people. So if you've got like a watershed group and it's not too politicized, and you can say, look, let's look at the facts and have a reasoned discussion on this, I think you're good. Where you get into problems, and in fact where we've continued to have some problems, is when this gets to be politicized so that, groups it's black and white, and you can't, it's almost like we know the answer. Don't confuse me with the facts. I'm not sure that this is going to help you very much if you've gotten to that stage, right? And so where we had problems was with not the individual farmers. I'm happy to go out and talk to any group out in various places, and we have a good time, and they say, okay, yeah, this is good, and what about this factor? And yeah, that's a good point. So where we come into problems is with the kind of the overall, the lobbying group, because they know what the answer is and they don't want to hear, So anyway, so if you get at the right stage and it's not sort of political and people are willing to listen, and you say, look, I care about your returns, but I also care about the water quality, and how do we so if you can get people onto that sort of cooperative, say, we got multiple things we care about here, and how are we going to all get some of what we want, then you're good. But when it's the politics, let's put it this way: if it's like Washington D.C., it's hopeless. Well, not hopeless, but close to.
All right. Take that the last question.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks.